My name is Keith Duffin, and I'm going to tell a story of a pioneer event that took place in my ancestors, mainly my grandfather's family and his brother. Now, my grandfather's name was Hezekiah Erastus Duffin. That's a biblical name, and it'll be a little funny for a lot of people, but that was his name. And the other character that'll be with him was his brother Joseph Duffin. They were two brothers of five in that family in southern Utah in the early days of 1900. Now, the story as it goes, they were living in southern Utah, not in St. George, but not very far. Tokerville was one of the communities that they lived in, and they were mainly sheep people. They run sheep in those days. But my grandfather and this brother, Joseph, they decided that they would have to move out because the ability to manage the sheep and make a living was very meager. So they thought they'd try orcharding. So they moved up to close to Salt Lake, which was called, right now it's called Orem, Utah. In those days it was called, another name, but it was all fruits and orchards in those days, right close to Provo. But even then, they had a hard time making a living. So my grandfather, with the permission of both families, went on a trip to southern Idaho to scout out a place that they might consider moving to and maybe even relocating to raise their families and keep them busy and find enough to make it that they figured they could make a living. So my grandfather did that by coming up here by rail from Provo to Pocatello to Blackfoot. Then from Blackfoot, the rail would bring the people on down to Aberdeen. So he come here and scouted out the area and decided that they could come here and maybe try farming, which would be raising stock, milking cows, potatoes, sugar beets, grain. So he went back and told, we called him Uncle Joe, his brother and his family, about the situation here, and they all decided that they could come up here. And this was in 1918, early 1918. So they packed up. They had to load all their goods into two railroad cars. One car held the animals, and the other car held the two families. And it took 4 days for them to come up here. Having arrived here, coming by way of Pocatello, Blackfoot, and then coming down to Aberdeen, the situation was nothing like it is today because there wasn't near the buildings, trees, and that. But they arrived at the train station, and the train station in those days was one block to the east of Main Street. And as they told the story, when they arrived here, there was supposed to be on Main Street on the west side a canal office building for the irrigation system of the valley. And the wind was blowing so hard and the tumbleweeds rolling and the dust blowing that they couldn't even identify the canal office. That was their introduction to Aberdeen. And there's been many days like that since. But they did scout around and they found a place that they would each liked to go ahead and settle by renting the ground. And there was a home on each parcel of ground, and they started their families, continue raising their families and farming. Well, as time went on, my grandfather was very active in the church. And I'd like to mention on this part of the story that when he was younger and he wasn't married, the church called him on a mission into the Pacific to the Sandwich. Now, let me say that again, the Sandwich Islands, which later become the Hawaiian Islands. My grandfather spent 3 years there before he married in while they resided in southern Utah. And after he had spent 3 years on a mission in the Hawaiian Islands, he had quite an experience and become very proficient in being a scriptorian. They released him, he got married, and had even started a family, and they called him on another mission. Now, his first mission, as I mentioned, was 3 years. This mission was to be 2.5 years in Nashville, Tennessee, which he did. Coming back, he rejoined with his wife, and she was a school teacher, so she was busy while he was gone. And that's when I told the beginning of the story, when they moved from there to Provo and then on up to Aberdeen and resettled. And I'd like to mention one thing about Grandpa. My mother used to just cringe when the ministers would go from house to house. My grandfather could, I think, as far as I was concerned, could smell a minister, and that was his delight, was to get with the minister and argue the gospel. We don't do that nowadays. But that's my story about how the Duffin side come up here to Aberdeen in the early days and settled in this part of the country.